The 47th floor was not designed for the living. It was a sterile tomb of glass and filtered air, suspended high within the city's bruised, purple sky. A persistent, subaudible thrum vibrated through the floorboards, indistinguishable from the migraine taking root behind Elis's left eye. The office smelled of ozone and the acrid ghost of burnt coffee, a scent that did nothing to mask the violent heat of the fever radiating from her skin. Here, weakness was the only sin, and as the numbers on her screen dissolved into a chaotic river of black digits, Elis realized she was no longer an employee. She was a glitch waiting to be purged. Each keystroke sent a tiny, sharp shock up her wrist. The numbers on the spreadsheet swam, a chaotic river of black digits on a glaring white field. She blinked, and the afterimage burned green against her eyelids. The air, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, did nothing to cool the fever that was simmering under her skin. A clammy sheen coated her forehead, yet a violent shiver just racked her shoulders, forcing a hitched breath from her lungs. The wool of her blazer felt like sandpaper against her neck. She squeezed her eyes shut, just for a second. The thrumming in her bones intensified. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, the sky over the city was the color of a fresh bruise, a heavy, bruised purple gray that promised a storm. The office, by contrast, was a sterile, aseptic tomb of light and quiet industry. It smelled of ozone from the server racks and the faint, acrid ghost of burnt coffee. She had to finish the quarterly depreciation analysis before lunch. A simple task, a task she could normally do in her sleep. But today, her fingers felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from her brain. She typed the same formula 3 times, a simple sum if, and each time the cell had screamed back at her with a venomous #value. Error. A small, pathetic sound escaped her lips, half groan, half whimper. She deleted the line again, the cursor blinking at her, patient, mocking. The hum went on. Her bones ached with it. A shadow fell over her desk. It wasn't just a blocking of the overhead light. It was a sudden drop in temperature, a pocket of colder air that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The scent of expensive, spicy cologne cut through the sterile office smell. Dax Kroll. He didn't need to speak. His presence was an announcement. She forced her head up. The movement sent a wave of nausea through her, hot and acidic. Dax stood over her cubicle, a monolith in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His tie was a slash of silver silk, knotted with geometric precision. Not a single strand of his salt and pepper hair was out of place. He wasn't looking at her, but at her monitor, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line of disapproval. "Ivers," he said. His voice was smooth, polished, the kind of voice that made directives sound like friendly suggestions, but they were not. Having some trouble with the depreciation schedule? The question was a blade disguised as a bandage. Elis swallowed, her throat feeling like it was lined with ground glass. Just double-checking the asset classes, Dax. Want to make sure the amortization is properly bucket. The corporate jargon fell from her lips like dead leaves, dry and weightless. It was a language she'd learned to speak as Shield. He made a small, non-committal noise in his throat. His gaze finally flickered to her, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, narrowed almost imperceptibly. He took in her pallor, the faint tremor in her hands, the sweat on her hairline. She saw not a flicker of concern. She saw only annoyance, as if her illness were a deliberate inconvenience aimed directly at him. "The optics on this are time-sensitive," he continued, his tone never changing. "I need those projections finalized for the steering committee." Yodi. He placed a slim, black folio on the corner of her desk. The plastic made a sharp, definitive slap against the laminate. "This is the preliminary data from acquisitions. It needs to be integrated. I expect a full synergy deck ready for my review by 4. Synergy deck. Yodi." The words were stones dropped into the churning pool of her fever. For her clock was 3 hours away. Integrating the new data alone would take that long on a good day. Today, it was an impossibility. It was a death sentence. "Dax," she started, her voice cracking. "I might need to—" He held up a hand, a single, manicured finger raised. "Don't tell me about problems, Elis. Tell me about solutions. We're all leaning in on this one. Show some initiative. He gave her a smile that did not touch his eyes. It was a baring of teeth. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, his polished loafers making no sound on the industrial carpet as he moved down the aisle. The cold spot his presence had created lingered for a moment before the office's regulated chill rushed back in. The black folio sat on her desk, radiating a quiet menace. Elis stared at it, her vision blurring at the edges. The room seemed to tilt, the ceiling pressing down. The hum in her bones was a roar now. She had to do this. Failure was not an option in this ecosystem. It was an extinction-level event. Her hand trembled as she reached for the folio. The plastic was cool and smooth. Inside, dozens of pages of dense, numbered tables waited for her. It was a mountain, and she had no strength to climb. She tried. For an hour that stretched into an eternity, she tried. The rain began, a few tentative taps against a massive pane of glass that soon became a frantic, percussive drumming. The bruised sky went almost black. The office lights flickered once, twice, making everyone in the open-plan space murmur before the backup generators kicked in with a low, groaning sigh. Elis's body was a war zone. Chills and fever fought for territory, sending waves of goosebumps and sweat across her skin. The ache in her joints had deepened, a throbbing, rhythmic pain that matched the beat of the rain. Every time she managed to focus on a line of data, the numbers would ripple and dissolve, like ink in water. She propped her head in one hand, the pressure of her palm against her temple a small, anchoring pain against the larger, formless agony inside. She could feel the curious, sideways glances from the neighboring cubicles. She was a wounded animal, and the herd was watching, waiting for her to fall. Her mouse hand was slick with sweat. She clicked on the wrong cell, dragging a formula across a dozen rows and turning a neat column into a cascade of error messages. A strangled sob caught in her throat. She slammed her hand down on the desk. The plastic cup of pens jumped, one rolling off the edge and clattering to the floor. The sound was unnervously loud in the tense quiet. She had to get up, splash water on her face. Anything. Pushing back her chair, she stood, and the world spun violently. The grid of cubicles, the muted gray carpet, the distant glass-walled conference rooms, it all smeared into a nauseating vortex. She grabbed the fabric wall of her cubicle to steady herself, her knuckles white. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The air felt thick, syrupy, impossible to draw in her lungs. That was when he returned. She didn't see him approach. She just felt that familiar, predatory chill cut through her feverish haze. Dax stood in the opening of her cubicle, his arms crossed. The storm outside raged, and a flash of lightning bleached the room for a split second, casting his face in stark, cruel shadows. He looked at the chaos of error messages on her screen. He looked at the pen on the floor. He looked at her, swaying, clinging to the wall like a shipwrecked survivor. "This isn't working out, Ivers," he said. The words were quiet, almost gentle, which made them infinitely more brutal. The world stopped spinning and simply fell away from beneath her feet. "What?" The word was a puff of air. "Your performance has been lagging. Your engagement is down." And frankly, he gestured vaguely at her disheveled, pathetic state. This lack of professionalism is becoming a liability. He wasn't firing an employee. He was decommissioning a faulty piece of equipment. I'm sick, Dax," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash. "We all have obligations," he replied, his voice a sheet of ice. "The team's bandwidth is already stretched thin. We need someone who can fully commit to the strategic vision. It's been decided to restructure the department to better align with our core objectives." He slid a single white envelope onto her keyboard. "HR has your final paycheck. Security will escort you out." The hum in her bones ceased. It was replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. The rain hammering against the window, the clatter of keyboards, the distant ring of a phone. It all faded into a dull, distant roar. She could only hear the blood pounding in her ears. Security, escorted out, like a criminal. Her gaze drifted past him, down the long aisle of identical cubicles. Her eyes, clouded with fever and tears she refused to let fall, couldn't focus. But then, a figure at the far end of the office resolved out of the blur. Standing near the elevators, silhouetted against the storm-darkened glass, was a man. He was impossibly tall and still, wearing a suit so dark it seemed to drink the light around it. He wasn't looking at the storm. He wasn't looking at anything else. In the vast, impersonal space of the 47th floor, amidst the chaos of her life imploding, Elis felt the man's gaze land directly on her. It was not a glance. It was a heavy, physical weight, a pinprick of absolute zero in the fever-hot landscape of her pain. His name was on the frosted glass of the executive suite, a name whispered but rarely spoken, Theron Vail, the owner. And he was watching her. The weight of that gaze was a physical thing, a stiletto of ice pressed against the base of her skull. It cut through the fever fog, through the roaring in her ears, silencing everything but the frantic, panicked beat of her own heart. Dax Kroll was still talking, his mouth moving, the syllables forming a smug, condescending shape. The words were meaningless noise. White static. The only signal piercing the chaos was the silent, absolute focus of the man by the elevators. Theron Vail. He made no move, his stillness a vortex in the mundane churn of the office. Then, two figures detached themselves from the reception area. Security. Their navy blue blazers were crisply pressed, their steps purposeful, their presence a klaxon of finality. They were coming for her. And the man who owned the sky in this city, the man who owned the very air she was breathing, just watched. Elis's hands began to shake. Not the subtle tremor of the fever, but a violent, uncontrollable quake. She looked down at them, detached, as if they belonged to someone else. Her fingers fumbled with the few items that had marked this 6-foot by 6-foot beige box as hers. A ceramic mug, a gift from her mother with a chip on the rim. A small, succulent plant, now withered and brown from neglect, its soil bone dry. A framed photo of her and her sister on a beach, their faces bright with the sun she could no longer remember feeling. She tried to pick up the mug, but her fingers were clumsy, numb. It slipped, hitting the desk with a sharp crack that echoed the fracture in her own composure. Dax let out a small, pitying sigh, the sound designed to be heard by the nearest cubicles. "Careful there, Elis. We wouldn't want you to break anything on your way out." His voice was coated in a false sympathy that was more insulting than open contempt. "Maybe take a few days to get your strength back. You've seemed drained for a while now." The security guard arrived, flanking her cubicle. They didn't touch her. They didn't have to. Their presence was a cage. One was older, with a soft, tired face that offered a flicker of apology. The other was young, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point just over her head, avoiding contact. "Ma'am," the younger one said, his voice flat, "if you'll gather your personal effects." Personal effects. The phrase was so clinical, so sterile. It stripped the last shreds of meaning from her small, curated life here. She shoved the dead plant, the broken mug, and the photo into her tote bag. She left the box of expensive pens, the ergonomic mousepad, the company-branded stress ball. They weren't hers. Nothing here was. She pulled the strap of her bag over her shoulder, the weight of it a miserable anchor. She refused to touch the white envelope Dax had left on her keyboard. Let them mail it. Let it be one final, petty act of defiance. She stood, and the room tilted violently. The fever surged, turning the edges of her vision dark and fuzzy. For a moment, she thought she would collapse right there, a final, pathetic spectacle for the entire department. She gripped the fabric wall of the cubicle, the rough material digging into her palm, and forced herself upright. The walk began. It was the longest walk of her life. 100 feet of beige carpet that felt like a mile of broken glass. Her colleagues, people she had shared lunches and late nights with, refused to meet her eyes. Heads were bent studiously over monitors. Fingers typed with sudden, furious intensity. The silence was deafening, broken only by the squeak of the guard's rubber-soled shoes on the polished concrete floor and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She could feel their gazes on her back as she passed, a prickle of morbid curiosity and profound relief. And through it all, she felt him. Theron Vail. He hadn't moved, a statue carved from night. She kept her eyes locked on the silver elevator doors ahead, but his attention was a physical pressure, a cold spot on her skin. She felt dissected, analyzed, every shiver of weakness, every tremor of humiliation, observed and recorded by an intelligence that was utterly alien. Why was he watching? The owner of a multi-billion-dollar global corporation didn't personally witness the firing of a junior data analyst. It didn't happen. It was a break in the natural order of things, and that frightened her more than losing her job. The elevator arrived with a soft, mournful chime. The doors slid open, revealing a mirrored steel box. As she stepped inside, flanked by the two guards, she chanced a final glance down the long corridor. Dax was already back at his desk, laughing with another manager. And at the far end of the office, the silhouette of Theron Vail was gone. The space where he had stood was just empty air, but the chill remained. The doors slid shut, encasing her in polished steel and suffocating silence. Her reflection stared back at her, a pale, haggard woman with fever-bright eyes and hair plastered to her damp forehead. The guards stood impassively, one in front of her, one behind, their gazes fixed on the glowing floor indicator. 47. The drop in her stomach was sickening. 46. Each number was a step further away from the life she had fought so hard to build. 45. The health insurance. The one decent thing about this job. A cold dread, far worse than the fever, seeped into her bones. How would she pay for the treatments now? The specialist visits? The medication that cost more than a rent? 30. 20. The elevator slowed, its hum changing pitch. The doors opened onto the 15th floor. Human resources. The older guard gestured with his chin. This way, ma'am. The HR department was an oasis of muted grays and calming blues, populated by people with serene smiles and empty eyes. A woman named Brenda, whose nameplate identified her as an exit transition specialist, handed Elis a thick folder and a pen. Just need you to sign here, here, and here, Brenda said, her voice a gentle, practiced monotone. She pointed to various lines with a perfectly manicured finger, never once making eye contact with Elis's face. The papers were full of legal jargon, non-disclosure agreements, final wage acknowledgments, COBRA information that seemed to mock her with its exorbitant price tags. Elis's hand was shaking so badly she could barely form her own name. The signature was a jagged, spidery mess. Her, reduced to a desperate scribble on a meaningless form. Brenda took the folder, her smile never wavering. Your final paycheck will be direct deposited within 72 hours. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. The words were as hollow as a drum. The ride down to the lobby was even quieter. The guards had completed their duty. She was officially processed, expunged. She clutched the strap of her tote bag, the sharp edge of the broken mug digging into her hip. The elevator chimed one last time, a sound like a death knell. The doors opened onto the building's main lobby. It was a cavern of marble and glass, 3 stories high, with a suspended sculpture of twisting metal that looked like a captured lightning bolt. Outside the massive windows, the storm had broken. Rain lashed against the glass in furious sheets, and distant thunder rumbled, shaking the very foundations of the tower. The security guards walked her to within 20 feet of the main revolving doors, a silent, final transfer of custody. Have a good day, ma'am. The younger one mumbled, and then they turned and walked back to their station, their duty done. She was alone, utterly alone in the vast, echoing space. She looked through the rain-streaked glass at the street beyond. Yellow cabs crawled through the deluge, their lights smearing in the downpour. People hurried past under umbrellas, heads bent against the wind. The world was still moving, oblivious to the fact that hers had just stopped. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of floor polish and rain. One more step, just push through the revolving door and be spat out into the storm. Then what? She took a step, then another. The glass of the door was cold beneath her trembling fingers. She pushed. Ms. Ivers. The voice was not loud. It was quiet, deep, and resonant, yet it cut through the roar of the storm as if spoken directly inside her mind. She froze, her hand flat against the glass. It wasn't a voice you could ignore. It was a voice that commanded stillness. Slowly, she turned. He was standing 10 feet away, near the base of the marble staircase. Theron Vail. He hadn't come down in the elevator with her. He had simply appeared. He was wearing the same immaculate dark suit, a sliver of white collar stark against his throat. He wasn't looking at the security desk, or the storm, or the frantic city outside. He was looking at her. The intensity of his gaze was 100 times more powerful without the distance of the office floor between them. It was a physical force that made the air feel thick and heavy, hard to breathe. The security guards at the main desk had gone rigid. Their professional indifference had evaporated, replaced by a primal, wide-eyed fear. They looked like startled animals that had just scented a predator. Theron Vail took a step towards her. His movement was fluid, impossibly silent on the marble floor. He didn't walk. He flowed. The space between them shrank with an unnatural speed. He stopped just out of arm's reach. Up close, he was even taller than she had realized, a towering monolith of shadow and wealth. His face was all sharp angles and pale, flawless skin. But his eyes, they were the oldest things she had ever seen. Darker than pupils, they held no reflection, only a depth that seemed to pull at the light, to swallow it whole. He paid no attention to her damp, disheveled appearance, or the pathetic tote bag she clutched like a shield. His dark eyes were locked on hers, and she felt stripped bare, every fear, every cell of sickness in her body, laid out for his inspection. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in the direction of the security desk. A dismissal. The guards practically scrambled to their feet, one fumbling with his radio, the other suddenly finding a deep and abiding interest in a monitor. They averted their eyes, radiating a palpable need to be anywhere else. "There has been," Theron Vail said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her bones, "a misunderstanding." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. "Your tenure with this company is not concluded. Come with me." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a realignment of reality itself. Without waiting for a response, he turned, his long dark coat swirling around him, and walked toward the set of unmarked, dark-wood doors she had never noticed before. The executive elevators. He expected her to follow. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and a different, colder storm swirling before her, Elis knew she had no other choice. Her legs, weak and trembling, began to move, carrying her away from the exit and back into the heart of the tower. She followed his silent, retreating back across the echoing marble. He didn't look back to see if she was there. He simply knew. He pressed a thumb against a small, unmarked panel beside the wooden doors. There was no sound, but the doors slid open with a whisper, revealing an interior of polished mahogany and burnished brass. It looked less like an elevator and more like a private study, complete with a single, black leather bench. He held the door, his expression unreadable, waiting. Elis hesitated for a fraction of a second, her survival instincts screaming at her. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But the alternative was the rain, the street, the crushing weight of her diagnosis and her unemployment. She stepped past him into the enclosed space. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of old leather and something else she couldn't place, something metallic and sterile, like the air after a lightning strike. The doors closed, sealing them in an unnerving, insulated silence. The roar of the lobby and the storm vanished completely. There were no buttons on the control panel. Theron Vail simply stood, perfectly still, as the elevator began to ascend. There was no lurch, no hum of cables, just a smooth, impossibly fast, and utterly silent motion. It felt less like rising and more like the world was falling away beneath them. Elis sank onto the leather bench, her legs giving out. She stared at their reflections in the polished brass trim on the opposite wall. She saw a ghost, A pale, sweaty woman hunched over her worn tote bag, her face a mask of fear and exhaustion. Beside her stood his reflection, sharp, dark, and ageless. A predator in a bespoke suit. The contrast was grotesque. He hadn't moved a muscle, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze fixed on the doors ahead. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, and Elis felt a pressure building in her ears as they climbed higher and higher, far past the 47th floor. The elevator slowed as smoothly as it had started, and the doors opened. It was not an office. It was a sanctuary or a tomb. The room was vast and circular, its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves of leather-bound books that looked ancient. A single, immense window, a curved wall of seamless glass, took up a third of the room, looking out over the city. They were so high up that the storm was beneath them. A roiling sea of black and gray clouds, lit from within by silent, flickering blooms of lightning. The only light in the room came from this celestial display and a few strategically placed, low-wattage lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. There were no desks, no computers, no phones. In the center of the room sat two high-backed leather armchairs, facing each other across a low, dark wood table. Theron Vail glided past her toward the immense window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, watching the silent chaos of the storm below. "Please," he said, his voice calm, "sit." He gestured with one long-fingered hand toward one of the chairs without turning around. Elis moved as if in a dream. The thick Persian rug absorbed the sound of her footsteps. The chair sighed as she sank into it, the leather cool against her skin. The tote bag fell to the floor beside her with a soft thud. She stared at the back of his head, at the perfect line of his suit jacket. The power imbalance was absolute. He had fired her, or allowed her to be fired, and then summoned her to the apex of the world, to his private sanctum above the clouds. Dax Kroll is a man of limited imagination. Vale began, his voice still directed at the storm. He sees assets and liabilities, spreadsheets and performance metrics. He is a blunt instrument, necessary, at times, for trimming diseased branches from the tree. But his diagnosis is often flawed. He turned slowly. The light from the lightning below caught his face, momentarily illuminating the sharp planes and hollows, making his eyes seem like black pits. He sees your fatigue, your absences, your decline in productivity. He calls it a liability, a weakness, a disease in the system that must be purged. He walked away from the window, his movements slow, deliberate, each step closing the distance between them. He is not entirely wrong. It is a disease, but he fails to understand its nature. He fails to see its potential. He stopped in front of her chair, looming over her. The faint, metallic scent she'd noticed earlier was stronger now, an unsettling mix of ozone and cold blood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. How could he possibly know? "Your doctors call it chronic myelomonocytic leukemia," he said, the clinical term sounding like a blasphemy in his ancient voice. "A corruption of the bone marrow, a slow, inexorable decay of the blood. They offer you poisons to fight the poison, a war of attrition you are destined to lose. They speak of months, perhaps a year." Every word was a nail hammered into her coffin. He knew. He knew the specifics, the secret, terrified knowledge she had shared with no one but her physician. The room felt suddenly airless, the walls closing in. The low hum in her bones, the constant companion of her sickness, flared into a high, keening whine of pure terror. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. His face was inches from hers. The absolute black of his eyes consumed her vision. They were not eyes. They were abysses. The cold emanating from him was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical reality, leaching the fever heat from her skin. "The sickness in your blood," he whispered, and his voice was the rustle of dry leaves on a forgotten grave. "It is a type of corruption. I am intimately familiar with corruption, Ms. Ivers." He paused, and a smile that held no warmth, no humanity, touched the corner of his mouth. "The question is, Are you willing to trade one kind for another? The words hung in the space between them, a contract written in freezing air. Trade one kind for another. Her lungs refused to draw breath. The question wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis and a prescription all at once. The pain in her joints, a dull, grinding fire, chose the answer for her. The exhaustion that had become the very fabric of her days, the metallic taste of fatigue on her tongue, cast the deciding vote. A single tear, hot with fever, escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path down her temple. It was the only movement she could manage. It was enough. Theron Vail straightened up, the pressure of his presence receding just enough for her to breathe. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound, ancient finality. He extended a hand. His fingers were long and pale, the nails immaculately clean, like polished marble. It was not an offer of comfort. It was a gesture of transaction. She looked at her own hand resting on the arm of the chair. It was trembling, the skin thin and tinged with a sickly pallor. To place it in his was to sign away the thing she was already losing piece by painful piece. She raised her arm, the effort immense, a shudder running through her. Her fingertips brushed against his. The cold was absolute, not the simple absence of heat, but an active, parasitic cold that sank into her skin, through her flesh, and seemed to touch the very marrow of her bones. For a dizzying second, the ever-present, low-grade thrum of her illness, the hum of her own cells warring against themselves, seemed to quiet, silenced by this deeper, more profound chill. He closed his fingers around hers and pulled her to her feet. She was unsteady, a marionette with slack strings, but his grip was like iron. He held her upright. He didn't speak. He simply turned, his hand still holding hers, and led her from the suffocating quiet of his office. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them with a soft, definitive click. The walk to the elevator was a blur. The thick carpet muffled their steps, creating a dreamlike silence broken only by the frantic, useless beating of her own heart. The air in the hallway seemed thin, charged. The sconces on the wall cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced as they passed. Elis felt herself floating, anchored to the world only by the glacial point of contact where his hand held hers. He pressed the call button with the thumb of his free hand. The brass plate was tarnished, but the arrow pointing down glowed with a hellish red light. She leaned against the cool marble wall, the stoner relief against her fevered back. She could feel him standing beside her, not looking at her, but looking forward, a statue carved from night and patience. The silence stretched. The red light seemed to pulse in time, with the headache blooming behind her eyes. Then a low, hydraulic sigh, and a soft ding that echoed like a funeral bell. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the polished steel interior. He guided her inside. The doors slid shut, encasing them in a mirrored box. Elis avoided looking at her reflection, at the pale, hollow-eyed wraith she knew she'd see. Instead, she stared at the floor numbers as they began to descend. 52, 51, 50. Each number was a step down, a degree of separation from the life she had known. The descent was unervingly smooth, utterly silent. The only sound was the whisper of her own ragged breathing. The cold from his hand was spreading up her arm now, a numbness that was almost a relief. The fever that had been cooking her from the inside out felt distant, a memory. He had not let go of her hand. The gesture felt less like support and more like possession. The elevator slowed. Another soft ding echoed in the confined space. 23. Her floor. The doors slid open. The scene before her was frozen for a millisecond, a tableau under the relentless hum of the fluorescent lights. The open-plan office, the sea of gray cubicles, the muted chatter that now fell into an abrupt, cascading silence. And in the center of it all, standing by her empty desk, was Dax Kroll. He held a pale pink slip of paper in his hand, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He was in the middle of some pronouncement to a few hovering coworkers, his audience. His smirk faltered when he saw her. It vanished entirely when he saw the man standing beside her, holding her hand. Dax's face, usually ruddy with cheap confidence, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, mottled gray. The pink slip fluttered from his nerveless fingers and drifted to the floor. Theron Vail did not release her hand. He took a single, deliberate step out of the elevator, bringing her with him. He moved with an unnatural grace, a predator entering a feeding ground. The ambient noise of the office, the clicking of keyboards, the ringing of a distant phone, the whir of the ventilation, had died completely. The only sound was the rising howl of the wind against the building's windows. "Mr. Kroll," Theron Vail said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the cavernous room, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It was a voice of absolute authority, the sound of a tomb door grinding shut. Dax flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, clicking sound emerged. He looked from Theron to Elis and back again, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling in a sheer terror. "I was under the impression," Theron continued, his tone dangerously soft, "that your mandate was to manage the productivity of this department, not to cull its most promising assets." He took another step forward, pulling Elis along in his wake. She felt like a specter at her own wake, a witness to a demolition. The other employees were statues, their faces masks of disbelief and fear. They stared, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. She was underperforming, Dax stammered, the words tripping over themselves. He gestured vaguely toward the fallen pink slip. "Health issues. Attendance." The metrics were. Metrics. Theron repeated the word as if it were a piece of filth. He stopped, perhaps 10 feet from Dax. The temperature in the room had dropped. Elis could see her own breath misting in the air. "You speak of metrics. Let us discuss your metrics, Mr. Kroll. Let us discuss the quarterly reports you have been falsifying for the last 18 months to cover your own strategic incompetence." A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the office. Dax swayed on his feet. The waxy pallor of his skin shifted to a ghastly, greenish white. That's not. That's a lie." "Is it?" Theron's voice was silk-wrapped steel. "Shall I project the original server logs onto the wall for your colleagues to review? The ones from the archival server you believe no one has access to? The ones that show your department's actual performance before your creative accounting?" He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of mock curiosity. "I wonder what the board would think of a senior manager who not only fails, but then builds a labyrinth of lies to conceal that failure." Dax stared, his jaw working silently. The sweat was beading on his forehead, plastering his thinning hair to his scalp. He looked like a cornered animal, his pathetic bluster and cruelty stripped away to reveal the terrified, hollow man beneath. "In your personnel management," Theron went on, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a predatory whisper that still carried to every corner of the silent room. "This campaign of petty harassment against Ms. Ivers. Did you imagine it went unnoticed? Did you think the pinnacle of this building was so high that the stench of your behavior wouldn't reach it?" He took a final, slow step forward, closing the distance. He now loomed over the smaller man. "You are a weed, Mr. Kroll, a strangling, useless vine that has wrapped itself around something of value. And I have come to do a little gardening." He didn't touch him. He didn't have to. Theron Vail simply looked at him, and Elis felt, rather than saw, the sheer force of his will descend upon Dax. She watched the last vestiges of defiance crumble in Dax's eyes, replaced by a raw, primal fear she had only ever seen in prey. He seemed to shrink, to physically diminish, his expensive suit suddenly looking too large for his frame. "Your access has been revoked," Theron stated, the words falling like chips of ice. "Your accounts are frozen. Security will escort you from the building. You will not take your coat. You will not take your briefcase. You will leave with exactly what you have on you, and nothing more. A severance package will not be forthcoming. In its place, our legal department will be in contact regarding the aforementioned fraud. You are finished." Dax made a small, wounded sound, a choked sob. He looked around wildly, at the faces of the people he had lorded over just minutes before. He found no sympathy, only fear and a cold, detached curiosity. His empire of cubicles had evaporated. Theron turned his back on the broken man, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He looked at Elis. The abyssal darkness of his eyes seemed to draw her in, and for the first time, she did not feel terror. She felt a strange cold calm, a sense of belonging. "Come, Miss Ivers," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "Your work on this floor is done." He led her back toward the waiting elevator, his grip on her hand unshakable. They walked past the rows of desks, through the sea of frozen employees. She could feel their eyes on her back, 100 questions in their terrified gazes. She was no longer Elis, the sick girl from analytics. She was something else now, an omen, a protected thing. The pink termination slip lay on the floor, a meaningless scrap of paper. As they passed, a draft from the elevator seemed to catch it, sending it skittering across the carpet like a dead leaf. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them once more in the mirrored silence. They began to ascend. The lights of the office floor vanished, replaced by the polished, reflective steel. This time, she looked. She saw her own reflection, pale and drawn, her eyes wide in the dim light. But she also saw him, standing beside her, a figure of absolute shadow. She looked down at their joined hands. His pale, marble fingers wrapped around her own. The chill had permeated her entire being now. The deep, aching thrum of the leukemia, the constant, wearying companion of her slow death, was gone. It had been silenced, pushed into remission by this more ancient, more powerful cold. In its place, a new sensation was starting. A slow, deep pulse that began in her hand and was now working its way into her heart. It was not a feeling of health, not the warmth of life returning. It was something else, a quiet, resonant hum, the vibration of a tuning fork struck on a starless night. It felt like purpose. It felt like power. It felt like forever. And in the reflection on the steel door, she saw a flicker in her own eyes, a tiny, nascent spark of the same endless, abyssal night she saw in his.